the more you front load your effort into the writing and the arrangement, the more you do that, the more things will slot into place the further down the road you go, so that by the time you get to the production point, you're really just tweaking. You're pretty much nearly there, and it all sounds believable.
The last time Sound on Sound caught up with Lincoln Grounds, he was recording a 1950s style band in an authentic 50s style studio. This time he recreates authentic Nashville country using old and new hardware and modern software.
So in a previous Sound on Sound video, we were looking at the use of vintage equipment and how to use it to make groovy old recordings. Now I'm looking at having to do vintage sounds, but using modern equipment. And the reason for that is because this is a specific brief. People want music that is vintage in sound, but they need it to be editable and usable for pictures. This is a vintage country project that we're going to look at today, and this came from a company called Audio Network. Here, as you know, we're a music production library company. They needed some country songs that were kind of from the 40s and 50s sounding. They didn't want them to be too sort of crunched up and old vinyl-y sort of sounding, but they did want them to be authentic, and they could sit with scenes from America or American cars and all those shows that have, sort of old barns full of signs and stuff like that. So a lot of it was thinking about those sort of scene setting environments. And so we myself and Tom Utes in Nashville, who I work with, went down to South Carolina for a week and sat and wrote some old country songs with 2 acoustic guitars. So even the writing was done in the old-fashioned way. You don't have to go to South Carolina. That's just happened to be where we went. Well, retro and vintage is an interesting one for starters. There's a lot of people would like to, enjoy adding older sounds to their records, and that's because it gives them a flavour or an organic sort of feel that they're after, and that's what I would say is retro, and that's cool. Vintage becomes a different thing when you're doing music for picture, because it's not so much that we're sitting here thinking, I really want to listen to music that sounds really old. What this project was all about was creating music that would sit with pictures that wanted to create an overall feeling of a vintage scene. So that's where you have to look at the music from the writing stage all the way through to the production and say at every stage, even the lyrics have got to be congruent with the pictures that someone might use this music for. And so even from the vocabulary of the lyrics, so if somebody's going to use the song in a scene, which often they will do with these sorts of things, the lyrics need to sound that they're from that era. There are certain words that didn't really exist back then, and there's words that did exist that people use frequently in songs that we no longer do. So we kind of went through it in a pretty forensic way. The chords, the way the songs are arranged, had to be all kind of really consistent with those images that we kept in our heads. The more work you do at the beginning of anything, even if it was, 1970s rock, the more you front load your effort into the writing and the arrangement, the more you do that, the more things will slot into place the further down the road you go, so that by the time you get to the production point, you're really just tweaking. You're pretty much nearly there, and it all sounds believable. And the way that we went about arranging these songs to make sure that they were authentic was essentially by just booking really good players who know the style, and you can sit down and write a chart for a fiddle player, but if you don't absolutely know what you're doing, you're better off getting a fiddle player who knows the style of music. In terms of how songs were recorded from the 30s through to the 50s, it is important to do a little bit of research. And often it's going to save you a lot of time if you do a bit of research, because you will find out things like, well, in the 30s, if you were going to record a string band, you'd essentially put up a microphone and press record, and that was it. And it would go straight to a cutting machine, and that would be it. So, that saved you a whole bunch of time thinking you've got to mic everything up individually. For this particular project, we did have to have secondary recording because it was for a media company, so they do require separation and different versions to be made. But when it comes down to the mixing, I would, for main mixes, I would mute a lot of those microphones and just go back to the simpler setup. If we tried to recreate the exact recording setups of certain eras, I think we would have probably, it would have been very difficult, because there isn't really for each era, there isn't a recording setup that explains it, because if you look at the difference between Columbia Ray and Sun Records, it's completely different, but they're both from the same era. So there isn't, this is at the birth of recording, there wasn't a single way to do it. Everybody did it differently. So effectively, you can't really copy recording setups and expect it to come out exactly representing a certain era. What you have to do is kind of absorb what it is about all those different genres and those recordings, and try and distill that into something that, when you put it with the pictures, totally works and puts you in that era. So when we set out to record these sessions, we essentially decided to take our main mix using really simple setups. So we would just use a single ribbon mic on pretty much everything, really. We did the vocals, bass, the guitars, the pedal steel, and the drums, all with a 44. We did use stereo ribbons for the drums as well, so that we had the option to give the company a stereo mix. But a lot of these mixes are somewhere between stereo and mono. There's not, you don't have to go completely mono to get the sense of smallness. Going completely mono does bring its own other issues. You've got to radically change the mix, because you only get to mix front to back. You can't do anything. So, yeah, authentically they would be completely mono, but we, to a certain extent, didn't do that. Of course, originally in these periods that we're talking about, the 40s and 50s, everybody would have recorded in the same room at the same time. But the demand for this kind of music these days is often from media companies. So they generally will want you to be able to provide stems and different versions of it, so instrumental versions and versions with the drums, without the drums, etc. So we were in a situation where we wanted to create something that sounded authentic, but we did have to overdub and booth people in different spaces. And effectively, that's one of the areas where doing vintage recordings this way, it becomes more tricky. If you do it with a bunch of old gear in a room, it's actually really easy to get a vintage sound, because effectively what you do, you take really old gear, try and make it sound as clean as you possibly can, and its failure to do so is what gives you the vintage sound. But if you need to separate things, you just don't. You've got to find a way around that. I think what we're trying to do is, even though we don't know, we're not trying to emulate one particular studio or one particular sound from a particular era. I think our although we were overdubbing, our feeling was to visualize the singer at the front and the band behind, and then that's your close mic. The room mic we set up, even though we were overdubbing, we left in the same place, and basically we put the players in a relatively close to that when they came in. So when it all goes together, it makes sense front to back in the room. When we layer up all the parts done in the same room but at different times, because the mic was in the same place, they all sit together as though they were in the room at the same time.
I never thought I'd settle down in a sleepy one canteen town. So many.
In terms of tracking, what we generally do is to record the drums and bass and an acoustic guitar at the same time, but they'd be in different rooms. But they would record that following a Nashville number chart, record that as a pass, a whole take, and that's then the song. So the feel of the song is organic from the start. It's a performance from beginning to end, and then when we overdub people, they'll generally come and do their part again, beginning to end. We don't generally drop in. They have a map for the song, and we trust them to do it, and they pretty much always do. Strangely, we were using a click for this project, again because of the post-production requirements of its eventual use, that you need to be able to cut it in and cut it out really effectively. And this is, again, where it comes back to how do you get that feel of old records, but you're using a click? And 100% comes down to the players. You know, we've got people that can play to a click, but consistently have feel from bar one to the end of the song. And it never gets in the way, they just gel with it. But when you go to cut it, you discover they are all bang on time. And I don't know how they do it, but that's the importance of players. Pretty much everybody likes a lot click. When you're dealing with players that, you know, are in studios day after day after day after day and making records all of the time, you know, the click doesn't represent a problem for them. It's something they actually like. They welcome it because they know how to play around it. It doesn't affect their feel at all. So yeah, pretty much everyone wants a click, unless they don't, in which case we don't give them a click. But mainly people like a lot of click, yeah. It's really important that when you're writing for a particular period and a certain style, that you don't just research the production side of it, but also the arrangement side of it and the instrumentation side of it. So we select the right instruments to go into each track. So for instance, for something where you want a steel guitar, that's before the invention of the pedal steel guitar, you've got to make sure that your steel guy is not going to use the pedals, or he's going to have a lap steel guitar. So it saves a lot of time and a lot of explanation if the players already appreciate that and they go, well, this is from a certain period, so I will use this instrument. And generally we find that because we pre-think these things out, so we know who we want and we know what they're going to do. And even down to drums, it's really important that, you know, when you're trying to do something sort of pre-rock, that a drummer understands that how to feather a kick drum, which is a technique which is largely lost in modern music. Stuff like that, how to tune the kit, how to bring the right snare that does sound sort of old, you know. So all that has to be thought out. One of the sort of fun challenges of this project was getting the backing vocals right, and particularly in the sort of 40s sort of era. It's, again, pre-rock and roll. So people who would have done backing singing back in those days would have had great diction, perfect tuning, probably not use any vibrato, and have a very kind of a formal sound to them. And then when those harmonies stack up, behind a country record, they do have a certain a certain sort of conservative charm about them, let's say. But if you don't get that right, you're not in the ballpark. So, I mean, it fell to myself and Tom to do the backing vocals, so we spent quite a long time, finding out how our voices responded to speaking in different and singing in different ways, and trying to get it so that it sounded really straight, which is a way which none of us sing like that anymore, but they did back then. So here's a tune that I wrote with Tom Utz over in Nashville. It's sort of a late 40s style cowboy song. The cowboy songs were massively popular, and I think everybody would recognise the genre. I'm going to play you it first of all with no plugins, so it's more or less how it went down, and I think that emphasises the importance of the players and the instruments and the way they're played and that kind of stuff. So.
We've been herding doggies from Texas all the way up to Kansas City, in the saddle night and day. We kept on moving through it all, one adventure at a time. He's the best horse on the prairie. Why, he's the dearest pal of mine, just a man in his...
So yeah, it's got all the correct ingredients going on there. It's got arch top guitar, which is the right sort of sound for that era, pre-Telecaster. You've got a couple of accordion parts, but really simple, very kind of languid accordion. Twin fiddles, which is sort of classically a Texan thing from that era. The steel player is not using pedals, so it's sort of a lap steel part. But as you can hear, the the playing and arrangement kind of gets you a long way to where we're trying to get. You could probably put that with pictures, and most people would be pretty much happy with that. I'm going to put all the plugins in. Good, that worked. So this would be what I would call, your clean main mix. This is a modern mix. It's going to have some bass in it. It's going to have presence. There's very little work I've done on deliberately vintageizing anything. So have a listen to this. But this is a loud mix that's going to sit with in a playlist with anything else, and it'll have presence.
His best friend riding the plain underneath the prairie skies, the wind and rain, steady as we go, singing a sweet refrain about a man and his best friend out on the plain. Adiole,
and if you're going to yodel, be good at it. And he certainly is. Okay, so that's, a pretty big mix for this style. Not necessarily super authentic, but still, you know what you're listening to. This is a completely different mix of the exact same recording. Oh, it went straight away. Good old Studio One. So here I've made some fairly radical changes. The vocal signal path has completely changed. I'm starting out with the little radiator. This is a plugin which is basically a emulation of the Altec Mic Pre, which I've used a lot of in the real. There's one over there in the real world, and it has a way with, particularly with when you put a ribbon mic with it, it has a way of distorting a lot and then not distorting at all. It's got a real narrow sweet spot, and it's absolutely probably the most common mic pre of the era, all the way through the 50s into the 60s even. Cheap as chips when they came out, I guess that's why they were widely used. And it does it like nothing else, really. The real thing does it, and the plugin does it. So that's how I've managed to get some crispiness on the top of that vocal when you hear this come through. I've used a modern plugin second in here because this singer had a really powerful upper mid-range, which I wanted to calm down before I went into a compressor, because I didn't want to hit the compressor. Every time he hit those sort of higher notes, it would just destroy the vocal volume. So before hitting the compressor, I've used something really modern, which is a dynamic EQ, just to calm down that area before we go into the compressor. So that when he hits and I've used an emulation of an LA2, which would again be a pretty good choice. But when he's singing hard, this thing's not going completely crazy because I've pre-calmed down his peak. That is a a modern way of doing something which old gear does naturally, and I don't know how it works. When I've used old gear, that's one of the things it seems to do. It seems to calm everything down so that you're not getting crazy amounts of compression on one note and then not much on another note. It always seems to, the old channel strips, or the old signal passes, they seem to be sort of squishing all the time, gently. But what I've done with this is basically copied that by just using a dynamic EQ. What else is going on here? You're going to see a lot of this fella. he's all over the place. He's even on the accordion. Drums have basically been reduced to one part, an overhead, and that's it. That's all you would need, and that would have been the ribbon mic. Bass. Okay, so I mean, the bass will be taken at anything super low, and it's quite low in the mix as well. But this is pretty typically what I would do to get a really old bass sound. Is you just wouldn't have a lot of top end in it. It'd be kind of a pillowy boom, and that's kind of as much as you'd get. The reverb is essentially, it's in the middle here is this little fella, which is a plate emulation. It's a really good one. But one of the things I find with all plate emulations, having used real plates, is that they all feel a bit too clean to me. They behave really, really well, and when I've used an old plate, it never behaved really, really well. It always behaved in a strange way. One of the things I've then noticed when using an old plate is that you don't get any kind of sibilances going sss and that kind of stuff, which which we'd all recognise as being a reverb thing. So I've tried to get rid of those by essentially squishing, very much, completely squishing it with this guy, the Devil Lock. So all the consonants and all that kind of stuff are just squished out. So you can't. It also adds quite a bit of distortion to the plate, which again confuses the feel of the thing. It just doesn't feel as clean. I've put a 100% echo before to give me a little bit of pre-delay on the plate, because I'm taking top end off everything. I still want the vocal to be in front, and I can't really do that with EQ by making the dry vocal brighter, because then it wouldn't be right for the overall sound. So instead of doing that, I've just put a pre-delay on the reverb so that you get a chance to hear the dry vocal just for a fraction of a second before you hear the vocal, and then that kind of pushes it to the front, but you can still use a ton of reverb, which is what they used to do. So let's have a little listen to some of this, and then we'll see what all those things have added up to.
He's the best horse on the prairie. Why, he's the dearest pal of mine. Just a man and his best friend riding the plains. Underneath the prairie skies, the wind and rain.
So yeah, I think that puts us firmly in the period that we're aiming for. You can use that. That sounds like something coming out of a car radio in 1950 to me, and hopefully that's, if this gets used with pictures, which it hopefully will, that'll be the kind of thing that it'll be used for. So this tune is called "Stayin' Out Tonight," and it's another one that I wrote with Tom Utes. This is kind of a shuffle, a real popular kind of country shuffle from probably the 50s. Straight up, I'm going to play you the recording with none of the plugins except for a little bit of the reverb, so you can hear the tones of the instruments and the players. From the get-go, we had the pedal steel, and the pedal steel bring this in. It's a really classic way to start this kind of a tune. It puts you right in the scene from the very first second. And that's another, example of if you arrange it correctly, everybody knows straight away, and they're going to more likely to follow you on your journey, even though you've done it on a computer in 2019. So have a quick listen, and then we'll look at some stuff.
Don't shut down the bar rooms, 'cause I'm staying out tonight. Don't stop the music playing, don't be...
Okay, the first thing I'm going to show you here is the snare. I did actually we put a mic on it, and I wanted to get this because so that's the drummer playing brushes, but in one of his hands he's also got a stick. So he's doing a side stick and brushes at the same time, which gives the whole track the right feel. It's not a common technique. I've not seen many people do that. Not something you have to ask that guy to do. He knows what to do. So that's one of the things about getting the right players. So that's no plugin. So that's essentially how it's gone down. Everything's pretty much dry and perfect intonation, played all the way through. Let's have a look at if there's anything. I'll put the plugins back in, and we'll have a listen to the kind of the full mix.
And don't be turning out the lights. Play another song about a love that turned out right. 'Cause mine has turned out wrong again. That's why I'm staying out tonight. Keep the cold one.
So yeah, that's again, you're kind of nearly there really, because it's all the right parts, but that's not a vintage recording because it's got bass, it's full, it's stereo, it's clean, all that kind of stuff. Vocals got a de-esser on there where he's had that 1K thing. He's going through an LA2. Let's see how much.
Don't be turning out the lights. Play another song about a love that turned out right. 'Cause mine has turned out wrong again. That's why I'm staying out.
So yeah, he's not thrashing that compressor too much, but he's there. Again, gone in with a pre-karma, so that we don't get into the point where a compressor's responding at one frequency and it's destroying the whole part. Now this is the same tune with some messing about with it. I'm going to play it first so you can hear, and then we can look at some of the messings about.
Shut down the bar rooms, 'cause I'm staying out tonight. Don't stop the music playing, don't be turning out the lights. Play another song about a love that turned out right. 'Cause mine has turned out wrong again. That's why I'm staying out tonight.
Okay. So that's we're deep into vintage here now. One of the things I'm going to pick out, because I noticed it straight away, and I'm sure everybody would have done, is this pedal steel sound. A little bit of distortion on there, which I love. You hear that distortion going through the plate. Now that's a sound I absolutely recognise from using old gear and a plate. It's like, it's not fuzz, it's not nasty, but without it, I've given it quite a bit of heat using my old friend there. And you can hear that it's not on all the time, it just catches it on the strong notes and then it's clear. So it's still musical, but that distortion then lives a little bit longer in the plate. But essentially, you've still got all the notes going on. So that's a really nice way to make things sound pretty old. Let's have a look at the vocal.
Don't shut down the bar rooms, 'cause I'm staying out tonight. Don't stop the music playing, don't be turning out.
So the first thing that people are going to notice about that vocal is, one, it's pretty distorted in certain places by this fella again. The second thing is there's loads and loads of reverb on it, but it's still really audible and you can hear the words clearly, and that's another feature of old records, is that the vocals are very much, 90% of the point of the thing. People used to mix the vocals way out front, far more than this is. So there's two ways in which I've tried to make it so you have that, ton of reverb that they used to use, but also be intelligible. And one of them is this thing.
Don't shut down the bar rooms, 'cause I'm staying out tonight. Don't stop.
So this is a dynamic EQ, a very modern thing. I've got to calm his upper mids, which I'm doing here. Every time he hits a certain threshold, it's reducing that. But at the same time, I need his consonants and his words to be clear, so that I'm doing the exact opposite, just up here in the upper region, so that when you watch this curve.
Don't shut down the bar rooms, 'cause I'm staying out tonight. Don't stop the music playing, don't be.
You can see that sometimes that's going down, and but that's continuing to make up for that loss if he hits an S or a T or something. So it's just keeping it really nice and clear. And the other way that I've tried to make it so that it's, again, super clear to listen to the words, is to use this pre-delay before the reverb. Same thing, 100% mix, 16th note, stereo delay. I've used the cheap tape setting on here. It won't be like that on the clean mix. It's a really good setting. It adds a crunchy sort of top end, and you lose a lot of the sort of warmth of the low mid. And when you're making something that wants to be, full of character, it's a really useful tool. I use it quite a lot. The mix bus is a combination of old and new. I've got a Sony Oxford inflator going there, into emulation of the LA2, which is pretty much what most people would use, I guess, and then a bit of parallel crushing, not to the point where it sounds like the whole thing is compressed a lot, but it just adds a little bit more dirt and nastiness. Okay, let's go to this acoustic guitar. I'm going to take the plugins off and play it for you. Okay, so that sounds like an acoustic guitar, but it doesn't sound like anything old or interesting to me. So this is one of my most frequent moves in mixing. Even if it's not vintage, to be honest, I use bandpass a lot. So now you're definitely in a vintage area, but just in mixing in general, I find it's really useful to, if it's not a super important part, contain it, contain it to where it needs to be. It doesn't need to sound like the best guitar in the world, but for this mix, given that it's an old mix, it's really useful that it just lives in that little pocket and nowhere else. And that's the thing that you can't achieve if you just use a vintage vinyl emulation on your master bus, because it won't go in and individually make things sound old. It will just try and make it sound like it's a record. The other thing I've done to this, which again is like you never would normally do it, is add some distortion to it. to me sounds like an acoustic guitar. You know, it would have been a vintage acoustic guitar as well, of course. But you know, it sounds really old. This is a kind of a fun one. This was written by Tom Utz. It's in the style of the kind of, I guess, 1930s gospel, mountain gospel kind of, you know, tradition. You know, it's lyrically and musically simple, uplifting, and it's kind of got that vibe about it. I'm going to just play you some of this tune. I'll start from there.
Sun is on the rise. Walk along, walk along. Raise your voice and sing a joyful song. You can leave your heavy load by the side of this old road and walk along in the morning. Travelers.
So let's take all the plugins off. You can hear how that actually went down. As you can see, you know, drums, no plugins at all. We've got a bunch of claps going on there, no plugins there. Acoustic guitars, no plugins. Very minimal stuff going on here. And this is how it sounded without.
Sun is on the rise. Walk along, walk along. Raise your voice and sing a joyful song. You can leave your heavy load by the side of this old road and walk along in the morning.
There's not a lot of difference really, truth be told. It really is just finessing little bits and bobs. And that's really because of this project specifically for media, that I have to also take into account how it sounds without the vocals and without X, Y, or Z. So when you expose certain parts, they do need individual attention. So that's why there is some processing, but when you hear the whole mix, it's not apparent that there's all that much going on. But essentially, yeah, that's a very natural recording, which is, you know, that's done with the ribbon mics, how it would have been done, but overdubbed, how it wouldn't have been done for practical reasons. So good raw material. Let's go to the vintage version of that and see how we can take that tune back to the 1930s. So with this tune, musically we've pitched it into the sort of 1930s, so it's really, really old. And so to be consistent with that, we'd need to sonically do the same job. And now you're really talking about the birth of recording. So you're talking about an era where, you know, you'd have a pretty rudimentary microphone cutting straight to some kind of cutting machine onto some kind of disc. There would be very little opportunity to capture much bass at all, and not a lot of top end. I mean, it's sort of scratchy top end, but obviously all in mono. So when you're trying to recreate that kind of thing, you can't allow yourself any width really. You can't allow yourself any depth of sound, and you know, in terms of frequencies. So you have to mix the way they did. You really have to put things front to back. You know, you've got to imagine, right? Well, it can only be in the middle, so it can either be. I can't accentuate the bass of something to make it audible. I can't accentuate the top to make it audible. The only thing I can do is put it at different distances behind the singer, which for this type of thing would be the singer, and then there's the musicians. So basically you put them all in the same place, and they become kind of one sound that sort of that is what it is. But at the same time, you want to hear the more character parts of it. So the fiddle, you want to hear the fiddle, you want to hear the mandolin. But looking at this, I think I've just basically switched off the drums. That's number one. There's no drums in it because they wouldn't be, for this type of music, that wouldn't happen. So let's have a little listen to what's going on here. It's quite a radical difference. But then again, if you listen to sound recordings from the 1930s, that they are pretty scratchy. So let's get going up to the chorus.
Up to the east, the sun is on the rise. song. You can leave your heavy load by the side of this old road and walk along in the morning. Travelers on
So you might ask yourself, why on earth would you go to all this trouble with all these plugins to make a sound like that? But that's, you know, that's some of the jobs that some people have to do, and this is the job that I really enjoyed doing it, to be honest. Lots of distortion everywhere. I mean, this thing is probably on, oh sorry, that's kind of a, that's just trying to make a low vocal more low by messing with the formant a bit. But where's the, this guy, yeah, he's on everything, lots of him. I'm going to pull out one particular instrument, the fiddle. And there's a point right at the end here, if you listen to this fiddle part, where it hits that preamp in a really nice way, which is exactly the characteristic that I like that for. There. That essentially is exactly what I would associate with a field recording from the 1930s. And that's the kind of type where the distortion just pops in because it's overloaded that, you know, the microphones were, you know, sensitive and fragile and not as robust as they are these days. And, you know, a fiddler player just going that little bit too close through that kind of old technology would drive it into distortion like that. And it's all those little bits that can all add up to something that feels like it might have been done in that era. Band pass again, acoustic guitar, exactly the same reason. That's the guitar sound of a, you know, old folk guy in the mountains, really. It's just sitting nicely in that mono mix. Same, and that's the lead. I've allowed him a little bit more top so that he comes forward a little bit. The rhythm guy is behind him. I mean, there's bass there, but I wouldn't imagine he's doing all that much. Vocal-wise, he's got great voice. On the vocal here, I've just gone for a band pass with real steep sides, and that kind of creates its own distortion, which is, for this application, is kind of just what you want, really.
in the morning.
Okay, so you can hear her voice is, you know, and that's just goes into an LA2. All these backing vocals have just got plugins on them purely because they are all from the same person. So I'm using this fella just to have slightly different formants on each vocal take so that it's more likely to sound like a mix of people. It kind of works. You have to mess with it a little bit, but when you're stacking the same singer and you want it to sound like a bunch of people, you have to play a few little tricks. So there's a little bit different compressions and stuff on each one, but just a little bit different. Not huge, but it looks like there's a bunch of processing going on there, but there's not all that much going on. The claps are all unprocessed. Let's have a listen to this dobro. There's a distortion on there, but that's not like an electric a guitar slide distortion. That's a microphone overloading style of distortion, which again is kind of the thing we want. So that sounds like a guy on the back porch. This is what he really sounds like. Important to note that is a very old dobro that the guy is playing there. So it's already got that sound built into it, and it's just a case of messing with it until you can change the time zone that you're in. Mandolin, similar again. I mean, yeah, there's pretty much these three instruments, the dobro, the fiddle, and mandolin, have all had the same kind of treatment. Slightly different area for the mandolin, for the bandpass. And then our old friend, a little bit of distortion. And that's kind of it, really, for that. You know, that sounds great because it's a lovely mandolin and it's really well played. And in the right style. That's really all there is to that track. Like I say, drums have been switched off. Don't need them in the 30s. You wouldn't take a drum kit up the mountain to play that kind of music. There's guys up there who've got the fiddles ready. So one of the things that I've taken from this project has been that it's definitely possible to make really good sounding vintage music which can go with pictures and was also useful. You don't necessarily need to have a stack of old mics and pre's and tape machines and all that stuff, and also you don't really need to have or invest in plugins that are set up to look and like they do that job essentially with EQ, compression, reverb, bit of distortion, and really good arrangements that are sympathetic to the style. You can get a great result, and a result that is going to work with pictures.
That's all for now. If you like what you saw, be sure to like, share and subscribe, and click the bell so you know when we upload new films. Be sure to visit soundonsound.com and our Instagram page as well. Thanks for watching.
Out tonight. Don't stop the music play.